9/11 was a great tragedy for the United States. It was also a great opportunity for military intervention abroad. Understanding how 9/11 allowed for a small office in the State Department to cook up false intelligence to provide a pretext for war in Iraq is critical to making sure such scenarios don't happen again. Currently, we can see a rerun of this approach with regard to Syria and its alleged use of chemical weapons, an allegation that a simple assessment of the facts will quickly demolish. In the post 9/11 world, however, allegations come quick and hard, and support is given to them by world leaders before they are adequately assessed as true or false. This is dangerous both for the Middle East and for the United States, as blowback is one potential form of fallout that can result in more tragic consequences. The purpose of this speech is to provide you with the information surrounding the invasion of Iraq, how the idea evolved, and why it happened. Having read many works on this subject and obtained a clear understanding of what happened during the lead up to the invasion, I would like to share with you the information that I have found in hopes of helping you to better understand the reasons for the invasion. The first source I will use is the Israeli policy paper by Oded Yinon from the 1980s entitled A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s. It lays out the vision for how Israel should expand its borders and destroy its enemies. The second major source is an article in the New Yorker by Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Seymour Hersh entitled Selective Intelligence. It is important to understand the context in which the post 9/11 invasion of Iraq was situated. In 1948, Israel was recognized as a state in the area formerly known as Palestine. It was a small state, roughly the size of New Jersey. By the end of the 1960s, however, it had expanded its borders, notably through the 6 Days War, and virtually doubled its size. By the 1980s, when Oded Yinon published A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s in the Hebrew journal Kivanim, which translates to Directions, a journal for Judaism and Zionism, the nation was looking for ways to expand its influence even more. The resources of the Middle East were valuable for all. Oil and natural gas and water were, and still are, in demand, and the strategic laying of pipelines was an issue that would involve both Middle Eastern countries as well as countries outside of the region, from Russia to Europe to the U.S., who controlled the flow of oil and gas to some extent. Oded Yinon's plan in the 1980s was for Israel to assert itself in the region by destabilizing its neighboring countries, which it deemed a threat. Yinon wrote, and I quote, "The dissolution of Syria and Iraq into ethnically or religiously unique areas such as Lebanon is Israel's primary target on the Eastern Front in the long run, while the dissolution of the military power of those states serves as the primary short-term target. Syria will fall apart, in accordance with its ethnic and religious structure, into several states such as present-day Lebanon, so that there will be a Shiite Alawi state along its coast, a Sunni state in the Aleppo area, another Sunni state in Damascus, hostile to its northern neighbor, and the Druzes who will set up a state, maybe even in our Golan, and certainly in the Hauran and in northern Jordan. This state of affairs will be the guarantee for peace and security in the area in the long run, and that aim is already within our reach today. Iraq, rich in oil on the one hand and internally torn on the other, is guaranteed as a candidate for Israel's targets. Its dissolution is even more important for us than that of Syria. Iraq is stronger than Syria in the short run. It is Iraq power which constitutes the greatest threat to Israel. Here one can plainly see that what happened in the years immediately following 9/11 was spelled out in a strategic vision of Yinon some 2 decades prior. But what does Yinon's strategy have to do with the U.S. invasion of Iraq? This was an Israeli strategy, not an American strategy, you will say, and you would be correct. However, leading up to the invasion, there existed within the U.S. government a cabal, as they called themselves, which Seymour Hersh points out in the New Yorker, led by pro-Israel agents such as Abram Shulsky, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Doug Faith, Scooter Libby, and others. Hirsch tells us that the cable, a small cluster of policy advisors and analysts based in the Pentagon's Office of Special Plans, cooked up and paraded the bogus intel that resulted in Colin Powell testifying before the UN about Iraq, mobile weapons labs, and WMDs. Indeed, all the actual evidence indicated that Iraq posed no threat whatsoever to the U.S. The United Nations Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Commission had conducted over 700 inspections in Iraq from November 2002 to March 2003. The UN reported that there was no evidence of Iraq having weapons of mass destruction or significant quantities of prescribed items. States Serenkion, Matthews, Perkovich, and Orton. Yet the OSP fed the Bush administration their own reports, which they based on an unverifiable source codenamed Curveball. According to Curveball, the UN had been unable to find evidence of Iraq's WMD program because the program was literally on wheels, i.e., Saddam was using mobile weapon labs. This was not hard evidence, but rather what the CIA termed soft data that really could not be relied upon because there was no way to establish its veracity. Yet where was the CIA in all of this? Unfortunately, the CIA did little to try to dissuade the Bush administration from acting on the OSP's bogus intel. The CIA and MI6, both of whom realized that policymakers were expressing an unwarranted, alarmist stance toward Iraq, stood by mutely for the most part. CIA Director George Tenet, along with Britain's M16, which did nothing to correct the mistaken assumption that UK and US leaders were making regarding the soft data put forward by Curveball, and the OSP stood by as the media began beating the drums of the war. With the specter of 9/11 still fresh in everyone's mind, the OSP took advantage of Bush's desire to act decisively. It thus produced false evidence, such as the smuggling of uranium into Iraq via Niger, to give a pretext for invasion. Linking Saddam to 9/11 in everyone's mind gave the invasion even greater moral grounds. But as everyone would come to realize afterwards, the intelligence had been wrong. The OSP had essentially tricked the US and the UK into executing the strategy pinned by Yenin 2 decades earlier. Policy had trumped actual intelligence. The leaders of the West had made themselves into the puppets of self-identifying cabal. When Israel became a state in the Middle East in 1948, a new order in the region began to set in motion. Today, this order is still being worked out, but as has been shown, it is following perfectly the strategy laid out in the 1980s by Israel's Odin Yenin. The invasion of Iraq and even today's war in Syria has been linked to the work of pro-Israel agents in the Pentagon and the U.S. State Department. And even today, as Russia helps Syria to combat those trying to destabilize the state and turn it into another Iraq, Western media has ratcheted up the attacks on Russia. Senator McCain has called Russia a greater threat than ISIS in an attempt to fuel the fire. The lessons that can be learned from this is that in order to stop the senseless wars that few want, Americans must be aware of the actual people who describe themselves as a cabal. They must be aware of their policies and why they are being implemented and put into place. Only then can Americans begin to take action.